Talking about workers' compensation. As a psychologist, of course, one of the things you may be called to do is to consult in one of these cases of workers' compensation. In workers' compensation, they don't hold trials, there's no juries. They're usually heard by an officer or a commissioner as far as workers' compensation is concerned. Clinicians are often asked to render an opinion about the existence, cause, and implications of any mental disorders that may have taken place. It's really kind of interesting. They look at these in a lot of different ways. There's three normal ways that these things play themselves out. It can be a physical injury that causes a mental problem, and of course they will want to know about that, which will cause, of course, a psychological disability. Usually it has to do with trauma. Sometimes it's a traumatic incident at work has caused other problems, other psychological problems with the individual, mental case. And usually that has to do with PTSD. And then the last one is a mental problem. A work-related stress leads to a physical problem, and of course we see that all the time. People have psychosomatic illnesses, may lead to high blood pressure, could lead to a lot of different things. So it could lead to a physical problem. The mental problem has led to a physical problem. And we see this all the time, probably far too frequently, more frequently than you think. In recent years, there has been a surge in mental cases. The reason, they're not exactly sure why the reason, but there are a lot of explanations. It may have something to do with, and I know this sounds sexist, but it may have something to do with the rise in female workers. Females do tend to be diagnosed with depression and anxiety more than males are, and for that reason, of course, that may have something to do with the fact that we have more females working. The other problem is, and if you think about women working, a lot of times they have families at home, so they're under a double stress, far more than we see males. We don't see males nearly with these kinds of problems that females have. It may be due to the shift in the job market from manufacturing jobs to service-oriented jobs. I was reading about this over the weekend. Of course, I'm reading people's papers, and they're talking about traditional Navajo culture. And one of the things they talk about is how the woman takes care of the home, and the husband goes out and does whatever the husband does. And of course, all this has changed over time. Well, it's actually changing over time in the American culture. When I was going to high school back in the 60s, they were educating us to work in the factories, and now the factories have closed. So all of those guys that were promised really good paying jobs, they're all pretty pissed off, and that's one of the reasons why Trump is so successful this year, or last year, because the working man doesn't have a job, and he's upset, and they thought that perhaps Trump could solve that problem. So we used to have a lot of manufacturing jobs in the United States. We don't so much anymore. Most of our produce, most of the things that are manufactured are being manufactured in China. For a while they were being manufactured in Japan and Taiwan, but it's more in China now. So it's changed the way the structure of things, and men are feeling the pressure of doing or having to go to school and having to be educated. We have lived for generations with men not really needing to be intelligent. Just being able to do something in a repetitive manner. That's all that they needed to do. So now things have changed just a ton, and this has caused a lot of problems in the United States. Perhaps motivated primarily by financial incentives. In other words, the individuals are feeling, they're feeling depressed or this or that or the other. Maybe they can get some kind of financial remuneration. That's a redundancy, I apologize. maybe they can get some form of remuneration for their feeling bad. Researchers have considered questions such as what factors threaten the impartiality of forensic evaluations in workers' compensation cases. An expert who is repeatedly hired by some attorney, whether a plaintiff's or defense attorney, or a defense attorney, may risk opining what the attorney wants rather than rendering impartial opinions about each other. In other words, I started without you, I'm sorry. So he's just going to keep repeating the same thing over and over and over and over again. And that's part of the problem, is the fact that can you really trust these psychologists? How ethical are they? Or are they just there for the bucks? And that's really the question they're asking here. They'll just keep repeating the same thing over and over again because they are called in to consult in a case. Okay, so that's workers' compensation. Let's talk about civil competencies. If somebody is thought to be competent, it means they can function in society. But sometimes things don't work out that way. Sometimes people lose their facilities, and now suddenly they can't really function in society. So somebody needs to take care of them, and this is known as civil competencies. It has to do with whether they have the capacity to understand what's going on. If you've ever been around somebody with Alzheimer's disease, eventually, of course, they lose their civil competencies. If you can diagnose them with dementia or with a dementia or a form of Alzheimer's disease, a lot of times you don't know when they start slipping. And this can be a problem. Somebody needs to take care of them. Somebody needs to make sure that they're not doing things that they shouldn't be doing, like giving all their money away or giving away all their property, my niece. We knew that my niece had a problem when she suffered from schizophrenia, and they moved her into a house, her own house. So she had a house of her very own. She had a house of her very own, and she started letting homeless people come and stay with her. Well, that wasn't a very good idea, because homeless people, well, in this case, the homeless people ripped her off blind. So she'd get a new toaster, and a week later it was gone. Somebody had taken it and hawked it downtown. So that was a pretty serious problem. So they had to move her out of her own house and into another house. So her daughter moved into her house and started cooking meth in the bathtub. I'll talk more about my great niece who's a meth cooker. So she had a lot of fun. Okay, so we're talking about civil competencies. These are some of the questions you can ask dealing with civil competencies. Is one competent to manage their financial affairs? And of course, this is real important, especially to white people. We're very, oh golly, I just insulted all the white people on the video. we're real sensitive to financial issues. And of course, that's one of the main things that you need to talk about. Can you take care of your own money? Can one make competent decisions about medical or psychiatric treatment? If someone prescribes a medication, can you look it up? Will you be able to decide whether you should do the treatment or not? I had a sister-in-law who had diabetes. She had type 2 diabetes. She developed diabetes in her 40s, strangely. And as she got older, she was doing a fairly good job of taking care of her diabetes. And then for some reason, she decided to stop. And once she decided to stop, she just crashed. I'll tell you, it was a mess. They didn't have to cut off, they didn't have to amputate anything. Normally, with diabetes, you lose your circulation. If you don't take care of it, you can lose body parts, usually your extremities, your toes, usually your feet. Anyway, She didn't lose any body parts, but her kidneys went bad. And once your kidneys go bad, of course, you need dialysis in order to stay alive. And in her case, she decided not to get dialysis. Well, once she decided not to get dialysis, you know, the whole story was over with pretty much. And she thought she'd just die. It's not the way it works. It took her months to die. As sad as that is. Dumbest decision she just pissed me off. She committed suicide. In essence, she committed suicide. So was she competent to make that decision? And in this case, nobody wanted to make the decision. Nobody else would make the decision for her, so they allowed her to go ahead and do that. In order to treat her, you can't really I guess you can. But in her case, of course, they would have had to have forced her to accept a dialysis, and she didn't want to do that. Really kind of strange. I've got some really strange relatives, don't I? Is one competent to execute a will and decide how to distribute their property? And of course, this is real important for people that have a lot of money or they have a lot of property. The question is, can they do that? Are they, especially if you have a split family, if you've got an individual that raised one family with one wife, and then he divorced that wife, or she divorced him, and now we've got another family, and that person has children as well. A situation that happened in my family. Had an uncle who was married, and he had 2 kids. His wife eventually divorced him because he's a jerk. And then he got married to somebody else. Well, she already had 3 kids. And it's not like he had a lot of money. That wasn't the deal. The deal was he had some money. And everybody wanted it. So when he died, his ex-wife didn't want the money. His current wife got the money, but she died fairly soon after that. So here we have this pile of money, and we've got 2 kids from his first marriage and 3 kids from his second marriage. Of course, they were stepkids. So the question was, who gets the money? And I'll tell you what, by the time they were finished and decided who got the money, there wasn't any money to get. I mean, it all went to the lawyers. It was just the dumbest thing you've ever seen. But the two families were fighting over the cash. And then eventually, of course, there was no cash to be had. Anyway, so are they competent enough to execute a will? And the strange thing was that even though he knew he was dying, even though his wife knew that all of this was going to hit the fan, they'd been talking about it. They'd been arguing about this for about 10 years before either one of them died. Neither one of them wrote a will. So, you know, it was all, they like threw all the money up in the air, and the lawyers were the first ones to grab big chunks of money. I know there was none left. My dad was pissed. My dad gets upset easily. He's a banker. He thinks people who can't take care of their money, there's something wrong with them. Obviously, there's something wrong with them. Well, he's dead. When he was alive, he was real upset about money. Can a person make advanced decisions about the kind of medical treatment he or she wants or does not want to receive if terminally ill or seriously ill? And we'll talk about that in just a second. So all of these things have to do with civil competencies. A lot of individuals will write a living will where they say, do not resuscitate, DNR, do not resuscitate. Okay. They'll tattoo it on their chest, you know, stupid stuff like that. Anyway, I figured, go ahead and resuscitate me. What the hell? I've died a couple times anyway. If it wasn't for resuscitation, I wouldn't be here. A competent individual is expected to be able to understand basic information that is relevant to making a decision. I was waiting for you to come in. So they need to understand basic information that is relevant to making a decision. They need to apply the information to a specific situation in order to anticipate the consequences of various choices. And of course, my sister, that was the problem with my sister-in-law. She had diabetes. She needed dialysis. And the question was, would she do it or would she not do it? And the answer was no, she didn't do it. So did she understand what was going on? Well, she'd been a medical transcriptionist for an extended length of time. Is that fire still running? Yeah, it's getting worse.
Controlled.
Oh, it's a controlled burn? Okay. As long as it's a controlled burn, I'm not worried.
Past that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I was worried. It's not worried. It's not that far away. They need to use logical or rational thinking to evaluate the pros and cons of various strategies and decisions. They need to communicate the personal decision or the choice to someone who can help them make sure that it actually takes place. So these are things that we need to do for civil competencies. Planning about future medical treatment is formalized through what are known as advanced medical directives, in which patients indicate what kinds of treatment they want should they later become incapacitated and incompetent to make treatment decisions. And of course, and a good example of that is the living will. So one of the things that you can do, one of the things that most people don't want to linger with, if they're brain dead, they don't want to linger. It costs too much money for one thing. It eats up all your insurance.
Being a vegetable, is that what you mean?
Yeah, yeah, brain dead. Yeah. Eats up a lot of money, and most people would rather die and distribute the money to their families or whatever. Anyway, a lot of people have done that. My mother was in her 90s. She'd been a nurse, so she understood all the medical things. She'd watched thousands of people die, which sounds horrible, but I guess when you're a nurse, you get to do that. When you're a lab tech, you get to do that. It's really kind of interesting working in medicine. Anyway, so she wrote this living will. My mother wrote a living will. My mother couldn't drink coffee. If she drank coffee because of the caffeine, she'd have heart palpitations. So from time to time, of course, she loved the taste of coffee. From time to time, she'd take a couple sips of coffee. And usually she could do that without any problems. But as she got older, she's wandering into her late 90s. She couldn't do that anymore, even though I know. So she would, and all of a sudden, she couldn't drink Coke anymore. All of a sudden, if she drank any Mountain Dew, she would have she'd start having these problems. So she had a living will, and she had DNR, do not resuscitate. And she got, so she had a heart attack, my poor mother. And my brother, of course, he didn't want to watch his mother die sitting there. I know. So he called the ambulance, and the ambulance came, and of course she had a DNR, which means that they weren't supposed to resuscitate her. Well, they did. Oh my God. This 97-year-old woman is just ripping these guys up one side and down the other. I mean, she used words that they had never heard before. My mother could swear. She was like the best. She was really good. It took her another year to die, of course. She died at 98, but anyway, my mother. Wow.
I have a question. If they are DNR, if they say they're DNR, but they do it anyway, can they get sued for that?
No,
No? Okay, I was just curious.
probably not. Because they also have medical directives that they have to follow.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, automatically you try to save people, right? I mean, it's just part of the way things work.
Okay.
I've told you the story about the guy who jumped off the building, scraped almost all of his head off. Did I tell you the story? Okay. Quick suicide story. So this guy decides he's going to commit suicide. And this is in Germany. So he jumps off the building and he landed right on the sidewalk. Well, German cement is rough. It's really rough. So it took off He took off all of his head from here to here. Yeah, okay, so, yeah, but it didn't kill him. That was the stupid part. I know, it landed three stories he jumped. And he just scraped off his eyes were gone, you know, his nose was gone. All he had was a bottom jaw.
So he was just sliding down with face first?
He slid when he hit. He kind of skidded. I know, it was a mess. Oh my goodness, because we had to go out and pick up what was on, yeah, chunks, exactly. Yeah, it was a mess. Anyway, that was later. That was later. So they brought him into the emergency room and he's still alive. He's still alive. So the doctor's working on him. He intubates him. He puts a tube down so he can breathe. I know. And we had commander's call. That was a funny thing. So nobody's there. There's nobody in the hospital except the doctor and 2 nurses. And I was late going to commander's call. So guess who gets called in to help take care of this guy? Yeah, lucky me. So I'm standing there, and we might need to cross-match this guy. Yeah, right, okay. So I'm standing there, not doing anything, and this old doctor came by, and he looked in, and he said, "Oh, what's that?" You know. And they started talking. He says, "What are you doing? This guy wanted to die. He doesn't have, his frontal lobe is gone. I mean, you know, he's a mess. Why are you trying to save him?" He says, "Well, that's what I'm supposed to do." And so the old doctor got a wet rag and he put it on his breathing tube and he died. What's my point? My point was the one doctor was working automatically. I mean, you've got to try to save people's lives, even though, I mean, what's the quality of life this guy's going to have without the front of his head, without any eyes? And they're going to, you know. He tried to commit suicide, and he failed. Do you see what the point I'm trying to make? Okay. The old guy, the old doctor, was really kind of interesting because he was Jewish, and he had been in Nazi concentration camps during the war. And you know, his whole philosophy was completely different than everybody else's because he watched people die that should have lived for 30 or 40 years. And the Nazis were really kind of cruel. They would, if somebody was sick, sometimes they'd just shoot him, but sometimes they'd let him live, and then they'd shoot the healthy people. I mean, it was just bizarre. They were doing all these odd things. Anyway, he had a really interesting philosophy. I know. Don't talk about people dying. But of course, you know, he helped him go. You know, the Jewish doctor. I don't know. It wasn't ethical. Doctors aren't supposed to kill people or murder people. But I wasn't going to turn him in. I thought it didn't make any sense to me either. I guess the immediacy of the suicide. You try to save the guy's life. It's just it's an automatic response. The doctor didn't even think about it. There was no argument between the two of them.
Maybe he thought about mercy for him because the person would have suffered with all what he would have had if he stayed alive.
Tried to commit suicide to begin with. Why save it? Well, I mean, it's not like you're not going to save all the suicides you possibly can save, but what was he saving? That was the other question. You know.
Can the body live without the brain?
I'm sorry?
Can the body live without the brain?
Well, yeah. I mean, he still had brain. He had his cerebellum. He had his limbic system was there. I mean, he could have had. The reasoning portion of his brain was gone. I mean, it was scraped all the way back to to here. So his whole frontal lobe was gone. Yeah, that was a mess. And then we had to go pick it chunks, like you said. It was horrible. Or not. I mean, we didn't even think of it as a human skull. You know, it was a mess. The question of competence to consent to treatment can arise when one refuses treatment that seems to be justified. Like my sister-in-law, there were a lot of people that were pissed off about the fact that she didn't that she wasn't going to accept treatment. But the people that weren't pissed off were her kids. She got two daughters and a son, and they weren't upset about it at all. It's like, yeah, let the old lady croak. It's really kind of odd. But all the medical people were really upset that she wouldn't accept the dialysis. If simplifying the information doesn't help, then one can administer a clinical assessment instrument like the MacArthur Competence Assessment Tool for treatment decisions to determine whether the patient lacks the necessary ability to reach a competent decision. In the United States, we have religious freedom. There are some religions that will not allow people to be treated. Christian Scientists are one of those groups. I had a professor when I was in college. He was a chemistry professor, and he was a Christian Scientist. He had diabetes, and it was type 1 diabetes, I believe. Anyway, he started having problems, and his legs became gangrenous. Eventually, his legs became gangrenous. And since he is a Christian Scientist, he believes prayer will heal everything. That was his idea. I don't know if you've ever been around somebody with gangrenous anythings, but there's an odor that you will never, ever forget. It's quite a stink. It smells worse than dead animals. I know, it's horrible. It is nasty. Anyway, so he became gangrenous, and of course you know right away because of the odor, of course, and it's a horrible, horrible odor. Anyway, so his best friend was the biologist, a world-renowned biologist, and he went over there to this guy's house, and the guy said, well, you know, I can't go into the hospital for surgery. And the guy said, oh, that's okay, I'll just do it right here. The biologist did. So he takes out his pocket knife and starts sawing away on this guy's legs.
Pocket knife?
Well, with his pocket knife, I know, it was dull too. He was just trying to hurt the guy. Well, that's it. He was just trying to hurt the guy to convince him to go ahead and have the surgery done. And he did. He went ahead and had the surgery done. But, you know, everybody's been laughing about that for, 50 years. He died a couple of years later. You know, it wasn't that big a deal. Or maybe it was that big a deal. But we couldn't get him to do that. A lot of, to go to the hospital to have surgery. His wife didn't want him to go either. And of course his kids are, you know, they're down there praying that his legs would miraculously heal. So they took him to after he cut his, you know, he didn't cut his artery, but he cut enough veins in his leg that they had to take him to the hospital just to fix it. Anyway, okay. So and of course this happens from time to time. A lot of times we'll get parents that don't want their children to be treated for one thing or another, and of course the children will die. Eventually, of course, if it is a life and death situation, then sometimes they'll take it to the court, and the court will remove the child from the custody of the parents, just to save the child's life. And that happens more frequently than you can imagine. Because there are a lot of religions out there that do not believe in medicine, as odd as that seems. Okay, so sometimes the court has to go in and remove custody, and usually it's right at the end, just before the kid's about to die. Clinicians can evaluate whether a person called a testator was competent to execute a will. I have a brother. I told you about my brother with PTSD. Well, he was the executor. He and my other brother were executors of my mother's will, and my mother was sitting on a pile of money. My dad had accumulated a lot of cash. We'd just gone through the Bush crash. I don't know if you remember the Bush crash where everybody lost all their savings. Anyway, so he was sitting on about $1 million, and of course the stock market reacted to the crash, and by the time it actually was distributed, it was worth about $500,000. And I got lots of brothers and sisters, so you can imagine how much I got. Anyway, so I've got a brother that has PTSD, and he was one of the executors of the will. The other executor was my other brother. I have 3 brothers. 2 of my brothers were the executors. And that brother had borrowed tens of thousands of dollars from my parents. And because he had borrowed all that money, he decided to opt out. He didn't want to be the executor because he was getting too much pressure from his greedy wife to stick his thumb in the pie and pull out as many plums as he possibly could pull out. So my brother with PTSD was the one that was the executor of the will. Now the question was, is he competent? He's, ever since Vietnam, he's been a mess, kind of. And he was the executor of the will. This is how, but his PTSD is really kind of interesting. What it has done, it's made him a Boy Scout. It's made him one of those people that never drives faster than the speed limit, ever. If he passes a sign that says the speed limit is 35 miles an hour, he hits the brakes and goes 35 miles an hour. He drove us to a ball game one time. We live in Muncie, Indiana, and this was in Cincinnati. It's about a 3-hour trip, and I'll tell you what, we had a conga, we had lots and lots of cars behind us, because everybody wants to go faster than the speed limit, and he will not go faster than the speed limit. So he's become a Boy Scout. His PTSD has made him a Boy Scout. Never breaks a law, ever. I know, he's kind of funny, or not. Anyway, so the question was, would he be a good testator? And the answer was he was perfect. Because this guy, he counted the money right down to the last penny, and he distributed it equally to all the brothers and sisters. My one sister, 4 brothers, 3 brothers. I'm sorry, I can't count. Plus me, I'm the 4th brother. Anyway, so the question is, can you execute a will properly? And that's another question. A lot of times people will die at an advanced age. That means that the person that is supposed to be the executor of their will is at an advanced age as well. And the question is, are they able to do that? And that is one of the things that you have to determine. The legal standard for testators' competence to execute a will. Testators must know at the time of making their will that they are making their wills. This is the guy that's writing the will, I'm sorry. So they need to know that they're writing the will. They must know that the nature and the extent of their property. In other words, if they own 500 acres, they need to know that they have 500 acres, and the 500 acres is worth a select amount of money. They need to understand all of these things. They must know that the natural objects of their bounty. In other words, if they own stock in Google, if they own 1,000 shares of Google, can you imagine how much money that would be? You own 1,000 shares of Google, they need to understand that those shares are worth a select amount of money, and you can multiply that out. They need to understand all of these things. They need to know, well, one of the things that happened was when my parents died, my brother had never been married. My brother with PTSD had never been married, so they needed to distribute the property. Well, we own 20 acres in a prime area. It's a farm, but it's used to be a farm, and there were farms all around it, but now people have been building houses all around it. So what was worth, I don't know, $600 or $700 an acre is now worth $10,000 to $20,000 an acre. I know. Because people are building houses all around it. So the property is worth a lot of money, in essence. It's worth a lot of money. So the question is, and he's living on the farm until he dies. He is the executor of the property. So that was a question. What would happen to my brother? He has no place to go. And my mother, who doesn't understand these things. Of course, my dad is the one that wrote all the wills. She had to understand that when she gave that property to my brother, with PTSD that she was giving him about $500,000 worth of property. Yeah. Well, $400,000 worth of property. Did she understand that? Well, she didn't understand that, but my dad did. And of course, he doesn't own the property, he just lives on the property. So he just takes care of it. He's the executor of the property. The property belongs to all 5 of us. They must know the manner in which the wills that they are making distribute their property, and of course that's something else that needs to happen as well. Evaluations include, number 1, a determination of the purpose of the will and why it was written at the time, gathering information about property holdings, insight into the family dynamics. Nobody likes this brother, everybody hates that cousin, you know, those kinds of things. They need to understand the family dynamic. They need to understand whether there is a member of the family who is greedy or not. And I have a member of my family that is greedy. It's mostly my in-laws. My sister-in-laws and my brothers-in-law. They seem to be greedy. My brothers and sisters seem to marry people that are greedy. An assessment of the general consequences of the dispositions and all of these things are quite important. Okay. As time goes by, the property that my brother lives on is gaining wealth. It's just the way it works. So if we wait for 10 years, it'll be worth, it'll double in what it's worth. Or we could lose. It doesn't really make any difference. I don't care. Look at all the money I'm making here. Jeff's laughing. He thinks it's funny. If my brother dies, I could retire. I wouldn't have to work here. Clinicians may be called on to give an opinion about a deceased person's state of mind as it existed at the specific time before death, and of course that has to do with writing the wills. And of course, if you've seen these shows on television, they talk about when do they write the will and which is the last will that they wrote. All of these things are extremely important, especially with extremely wealthy people. Wealthy people write wills all the time. It's really kind of interesting that they write wills so frequently. You can imagine Donald Trump's will. Just imagine Donald Trump's will. He's been married 3 times. He's got children by all of his wives. So how in the world is he going to distribute things? If he really does have $7 billion, does everybody get an equal share? I don't know how he's going to do it. I don't know. He's got properties all over the world. So, how is this going to work? And I don't know. I don't know how whether he has a will. We can't even get a hold of his tax return, so we have no idea what's going on. But you can imagine that it's fairly complex. He owns a golf course right outside of Washington. He owns a hotel right beside the White House. So, what a mess. Anytime that you look at somebody after they've died, it's referred to as an autopsy. In this case, it's called a psychological autopsy, where you're trying to figure out what was going on in the person's mind before they died.
I have a question. So,
Yes.
What if the family decided to make them do a will and they just came out of surgery? Is it still legal?
No, they have to be completely proper. That's the first thing you say in a will. Of sound mind, you're of sound mind. And of course, they're not of sound mind.
Because they had, what if they had someone power of attorney too, just in case? Someone as a witness to it, that works still?
Well, right, yeah, but the other question is, why in the world do they want to change the will at that point? He's able to be manipulated, or he can be coerced because he just came out of surgery. See, that wouldn't be considered. Okay. Him being of sound mind. Each state has their own way of saying that, which is really kind of fascinating. So sometimes you have to go back and do psychological autopsies to try to determine whether this person was of sound mind when he changed his will. Sometimes people get pissed off. That's one of the things that happens with people that have Alzheimer's disease or dementia. A lot of times they'll become agitated. They'll become irritated because something didn't happen or something did happen. So they'll write somebody out of their will. Well, can they do that? The question is, were they lucid at the time when they decided to write everybody out of their will? I had an aunt that had $35 million, sitting on $35 million bucks. And she was constantly writing people out of her will for one reason or another. She was kind of a strange duck. She'd been married 3 times, but she didn't, can I use the word sex? Okay, she was really funny about sex. So if somebody got pregnant before they were married, she'd write them out of her will, like that meant anything. By the time she died, all of us were gone. No, she didn't have anybody in her will. She left all of her money to these foundations. And she didn't leave any money to anybody in the family. It's not funny at all, I guess. Anyway, so was she lucid when she was writing people out of her will? I mean, she did this over the last 25 years of her life. She was writing people out of her will. So if they didn't do what she wanted to, she'd write them out of their will. I didn't care. I could work. I don't need her money. Anyway, it was funny. So you have to do psychological autopsies. Most rely on information found from 2 different sources. One is interviewing a third party who knew the decedent, the person that died. So you would talk to their best friend, or you'd talk to the person, their caregivers potentially. Or you can look at prior records to determine what was going on with this select individual. Usually what you're looking for is evidence of dementia or Alzheimer's disease, or just irritation, just anger. When I was working in Chandler, Oklahoma. Was it? Yeah, Chandler, Oklahoma. I was working in Chandler, Oklahoma at a rural health clinic. We had this guy that owned like 2,000 acres of prime land right out between Oklahoma City and Chandler. So he owned these 2,000 acres, the grouchiest guy in the whole wide world. We hated to see the guy come in because he was really difficult to deal with. And he was just a SOB. His wife was the sweetest lady in the whole wide world. And this guy was constantly writing everybody out of his will. Eventually he divorced his wife, this wonderful, wonderful lady that had taken care of him for 50 years. He wrote her out, he divorced her, and they allowed him to do that. He had nobody to take care of him. Everybody was pissed off at him. He was worth millions and millions of dollars. So he was mad at the state. He was mad at the state of Oklahoma. So he tried to leave his land to nobody. He didn't want to leave it to anybody. He didn't want the state to get a hold of it. So he's writing all this crazy stuff in this thing that he thought was a will. And eventually, of course, he had 3 or 4 kids. Eventually he committed suicide, shot himself with a shotgun in the chest. Sounds like he was murdered, doesn't it? I know. It was a long gun, too. How in the world did he ever commit suicide?
Toes.
He propped it up against something on his back porch and shot himself in the head. By that time, the only people that were interacting with him were the people in my clinic, the doctor and whoever was the unfortunate nurse that had to take care of him. It was kind of funny, or not funny at all, I guess, if you think about it. So it only took them about a week before they threw out all that crap that he wrote. And he had thousands of pages of just ranting about everybody, anybody that he came in contact with. He even had stuff in there about our doctor and about me. I tried to be nice to him, but it was tough. It was really tough because no matter what you did, you were a stupid son of a bitch. So, her missus going, I call him that all the time. Yes, I'm a stupid son of a bitch, obviously. Anyway, so they threw all that stuff out. The judge did, and The ex-wife inherited, his kids inherited, even though he'd written them out of his will like 15 years before. This guy's grouchiest guy I've ever been around. How has testimony about psychological autopsies fared in court? In cases involving workers' compensation claims and questions of whether insurance benefits should be paid, the courts have usually admitted psychological autopsy testimony. So as long as the person is relatively lucid, then they have accepted that testimony. However, not all psychological autopsies are the same. In criminal cases or in cases involving the question of whether a person had the mental capacity to execute a will, the courts have been more reluctant to permit the testimony. And that's mainly because there's so much involved. It's so much more important. If it had to do with workers' compensation, then yeah, okay. Or insurance claims, then sure, they will accept the autopsies. But if it has to do with a lot more money, or yeah, a lot more money, then they're reluctant to accept it. Okay, let's start talking about child custody and parental fitness. Of course, I spent all summer dealing with this with my daughter and my grandson and the father of my grandson. We were fighting all summer. It was horrible. We had to borrow money in order to pay for the lawyer's fees. And as I said before, he comes from a lot of money, so he had an unlimited amount of cash. And being wealthy, so if you've ever been around wealthy people, they think that they can get away with just about anything. And it's mostly because they've got the money to support it. So they can do whatever they want. And that's what he tried to do. What he tried to do was to spin us under the carpet. But it didn't work. Because we supported my daughter. My daughter was only making like $40,000. She was a teacher down in Florida. And she wanted to move to Iowa, where they paid better for competent teachers. So she was going to get a $20,000 raise. It's a healthier place to raise children. But the problem, of course, was that he wouldn't get the kid on the 4th of July or something. He's a holiday dad, so he was all upset about that. Just too far to travel. So he tried to keep my daughter in Florida. So that's what was going on all summer. The best interest of the child in custody disputes, evaluating families for the purpose of recommending a custodial arrangement that is in the best interest of the child whose parents are divorcing or separating, is a fast-growing area. And these are the new laws. They just wrote these laws last year in Florida. So the main impetus behind any of these custody laws have to do with the best interest of the child. What is the best thing for the child? There are a lot of questions, and a lot of it has to do with how old is the child. What is the situation with the parents? The increase in these cases is attributable to two facts. About 50% of all marriages in the United States end in divorce. I know it doesn't happen here on the reservation, but if we look at the average marriage in the United States, of course I've been married 3 times myself, so I know that these things do end in divorce. As of 2010, 34% of households with children in the United States were single-parent households. 34%. A lot of single parents out there. When I was in grade school, there was one divorced family in my town. One. And they were divorced right after they got married. I know. If you can imagine. Wait a second. My nieces from Chicago, they talked about being in classes where they were the only kids that had intact parents. In other words, 2 parents that were married to each other. Everybody else in the class was either from a blended family or from a single family. They were the only ones that had parents that were still together. And we've been trying to figure out what the hell's wrong with my sister that she didn't divorce that son of a bitch a long time ago. Anyway. Preference for maternal custody diminished at the beginning of the 21st century. I've told you the story about when I was, when I got my first divorce. My wife wasn't even contesting the divorce, and I still almost lost my children. Why? Because in the state of Texas, that backward state of Texas, the judge that was hearing my case had never given custody to a male. So I wasn't going to be the first one. And I told you the reason that I was able to get my children was because they weren't citizens of the state of Texas. They were citizens of the state of Indiana. So in order for him to take them away from, and he wanted to take my kids away and make them wards of the state. In other words, put them into the foster care system, because he didn't believe that men could take care of children. Especially since I was a single parent in the Air Force. That would have been a mess. It was a mess. I did it. I survived. We've all three survived. But he didn't want to do that. So, but in order for him to take my children away, he would have had to have petitioned the state of Indiana to release the children from being citizens of that state. And Indiana, of course, is a little bit more liberal, is a lot more liberal than Texas is. And they were certainly not going to do that. Okay. Just because there's some crazy Baptist minister judge that wants to take my damn kids away. Idiot. We took that thing, oh, it was a mess. It was such, and I'm in the Air Force, I'm making what, $400 a month? What a mess. Now many courts want to know about the parenting abilities of each parent before deciding custody. Currently, the prevailing standard for custody decisions is the future best interest of the child. What is the best interest of the child? And of course, that's what the judge down in Florida was thinking. I had to think about in order to decide whether my daughter could move to Iowa or not. Now, here's the strange thing. Future best interest of the child. Florida is a very crowded state. I don't know if you've ever been down there, but it's crowded. There's a lot of crime in the state. So but the problem was we couldn't present evidence to that fact. We couldn't say anything negative about the state of Florida, which is really hard since the place is as bad as Texas. So we couldn't say how wonderful Iowa was. Iowa was fourth in the country for raising children, and Florida is like 39th. But we couldn't say that. We couldn't talk about the crime rates in Iowa. Crime rates in Iowa are barely existent, and in Florida it's like continual. I know, and we couldn't say any of that stuff because we couldn't say anything negative about the state of Florida. Risk factors when a child is involved, stress of initial separation for the child, of course. And we were worried about that. We certainly didn't want to separate the father from the child, even though he had never lived with the child. Diminished parenting, of course, because there's one parent now instead of two parents. Whereas before there was always somebody to take care of the child. Now, of course, they would have to, the single parent would spend a lot more time in maintenance of the child rather than in parenting. Loss of significant relationships, including extended family and grandparents and friends. And of course, this was a worry as well. He's a very affable little guy, so he had lots and lots of friends. Well, when we moved him, he lost all of his friends. I know, don't cry, it'll be okay. He has new friends. I said he was an affable little fellow. He makes friends wherever he goes. He's really kind of an amazing individual. Because my daughter and the father of the child had never been married, his family didn't appreciate that. I know, that was a problem. So they didn't interact with the child very much at all. And of course we do because it's my daughter. So and we love kids. So we interact with them all the time, a lot more than his family does. And for that reason, of course, it was fairly obvious that our extended family was willing to support the kid, and their extended family, with a lot of money, there's a lot of money involved. Well, that means that they're going to have to chop up the pie, this money, this pile of money in a different way. And of course, we don't really give a flip about money. We try not to anyway. Multiple moves, including changing schools and loss of friends. Of course, if he had been older, he's in kindergarten this year, so he actually wasn't in school. So he didn't have to change schools. All he had to do was start in school. But he did lose some friends, unfortunately. Either parent becoming involved with a new partner, of course, and this is always a question as to what's going on. One of the interesting things that happened during the trial was that the father broke up with his girlfriend of 2 years. And the reason he broke up with her, of course, was so he could say that there wasn't anybody else involved. I know. Once he lost the case, guess what happened next? He went back with his girlfriend. Of course he did. He never actually broke up with her. He was still living in her house, sneaking into her house at night. I know, isn't that stupid?
I can just imagine him like, okay, baby, I just need to take a break for a while.
Yeah, just
Let me get my kids back first.
Yeah, let me get my kids. I don't really want him full time. I just want him to stay in Florida so it's easier for me to see the kid. Now he has to fly up to Iowa if he wants to see the kid. We're going to fly him down over Christmas. My wife and I are going to fly him down there. We found a rate that it's like $800 cheaper if we fly him on this one airline, and he doesn't want us to fly on that airline. Why not? Because he wants us to spend as much money as we possibly can so that we'll move him back down to Florida. But it's not going to happen. Yeah, he wants it to be as expensive as possible. The Uniform Marriage and Divorce Act said courts should consider the following. One is the wishes of the child. Of course, in this case, he's only 5 years old, so they're not going to consider the wishes of the child. Usually the child has to be lucid to an extent, and usually that has to do with being older than the age of 12. The wishes of the child's parents, of course. What do the parents want to do? The relationships between the child and the parents, the siblings and the significant others who interact with the child. And in this case, it would be the father of the child, the mother of the child, the grandparents of the child, except the two of us, despite the fact that we live so far away, we interact with the child far more than the other grandparents do, even though they live right there in Florida. My brother was living down in the same town as my daughter, and they were actually doing a lot of babysitting of the kid. So my son is a significant other who interacts with the child. The child's adjustment at home, school, and in the community. The physical and mental health of the parties involved. We don't want anybody to go crazy because they have changed where the child lives. Most states permit two kinds of custodial arrangements, either sole custody or joint custody. Each has two different aspects that we're going to talk about. One is physical aspect and the other is legal aspect. So if my grandson needed surgery, who would have to decide? He lives in Iowa. His father lives in Florida. Who would decide?
Would it be the mother?
It would be the mother. It'd be the custodial parent. What if the kid wanted a tattoo? He's 12 years old and he wants a tattoo.
Get him a quarter machine.
I'm sorry?
We put him in the quarter and then one of those.
One of those tattoos?
Yeah, that way.
Are those permanent?
No.
Oh, okay.
Or those little gums.
Yeah.
So what if the kid wanted a tattoo at 12?
Depends if it was a cartoon character or not.
No, it doesn't. So he wants a tattoo, and he's 12 years old.
You have to custodial?
I'm sorry?
Custodial time?
Yeah, it'd be the custodial parent. So what if the father tattooed the kid? We're tattooing babies. I know this strange stuff going on. Once upon a time, you couldn't pierce a child. Pierced ears, that kind of stuff. Okay. Until they were of age. But now you can pierce a baby. They don't feel it as much. No, they don't. I've spent lots of it. I've not pierced babies. But I had to draw their blood. Anyway, okay. So what if his tattoo would it be the custodial parent again, or could the father decide, I'm going to ink this kid up?
Probably the mom.
Would be probably be the custodial parent, whoever the custodial parent was. My brother got a divorce from his first wife. He had 3 kids with her. The youngest one was 12 when they got a divorce. But as they turned 18, and they came to visit him down in South Carolina, when they turned 18, he bought them all tattoos. How about that? I don't know how happy or unhappy his ex-wife was, since it's my biological brother. But my nephew got the biggest fish you ever saw tattooed on. It's a koi. He got a koi tattooed on his back. It just looks like a whale. I mean, it's huge. Why would you do that? I don't know. I don't understand. He's painted all the way from his neck, all the way down to his wrists, and all the way down his legs. I haven't seen his pubic region at all, but I have no idea. But he's tattooed all the way down to his ankles. He is the painted man. I know. Every Halloween he gets a new tattoo. I don't know what that means. Anyway, he's got tattoos all the way down all the way down his body. He's a bicyclist. He cycles. He's a cyclist. Physical custody refers to the living arrangement, whereas legal custody concerns the responsibility for decision making and, of course, who gets to make decisions and where does the kid live. In sole custody, the child will live with one parent, although the other may be granted visitation rights, and the same parent will have legal decision-making authority. So that's sole custody. So while the child is living in Iowa, my daughter has sole custody. So she has both. She has both. She has to make all decisions. In joint custody, both parents retain parental rights concerning decisions about the child. This is joint legal custody, and the child can alternate living in the parents' homes. This is known as joint physical custody. Usually one parent is designated as the residential parent. And in the case of my daughter, she is the one. So she is the residential parent. Differences between sole custody and joint custody. See, a lot of times what happens, and I hope you've never been in this situation, a lot of times what will happen if you get a divorce from somebody, the person you get divorced from, they don't like you anymore. And they want to do you harm. And potentially they'll use the children as pawns or weapons in this battle between you and them. Yeah, it's kind of ugly. So the assumption, and this is one of the biggest problems with the father of my grandson, is that he thinks that my daughter is still in love with him. He is deluded to the point that he thinks that my daughter is still in love with him. So he's afraid to give her any information whatsoever. She doesn't even know where he lives. I know, but he'll have to tell us in order for us to take the child over there to visit the father. I mean, he's paranoid, just bizarre. So he wants to use the child as a weapon, but of course, probably isn't going to happen. Really ugly situation. So divorce can be a really ugly situation, mainly because of all the emotion involved. Most murders, most people that are murdered are known by the person that murders them. A lot of times it's ex-husbands or ex-boyfriends or ex-wives or, yeah. A lot of times that's the one that does all that does the killing, and it's mainly because of all the emotion involved, all the feelings. Love and hate are very, very, very similar emotions, and if you lose one, it sometimes trips into the other. So you used to love this person, now you hate them desperately. I know, it's really kind of strange. So you need to be very careful of these situations. Once you wander into being a psychologist, you need to be very careful, because one parent will try to injure the other in any way they possibly can. Joint custody distributes the frequency of interaction more evenly between the children and each parent. Joint custody requires more interactions between the divorced parents and generates more demands for cooperation concerning the children. And of course, the operative word there is cooperation. Before the custody hearing, the father of my grandson was screaming that he would go to trial and he would make us spend all the money that we have and all the money that we would ever have. That he was not going to mediate. That was what he was saying. Of course he did, because he did. Because his parents told him to as well. That's why he did it. Joint custody results in more alterations in the caregiving arrangements, along with more separations and reunions between children and parents. Children in joint custody fared better than children in sole custody on a number of measures related to adjustment and interpersonal relations. And one of the things that we know is more suicides. It's like twice as many suicides in single-parent homes. They're more likely to end up in prison. Anything negative, and it's more likely to happen to a single-parent, in a single-parent family than in a dual-parent family. Okay, so the more interaction that they can have with the non-custodial parent, usually the better off they are. Does all that make sense? Okay, so when you're raised by one parent, as my children were for 5 years, a lot of times you don't turn out very well. Sometimes you don't turn out very well, and the statistics are against you. It doesn't mean you have to turn out badly, it just means that you have a greater probability of turning out poorly. Because you don't have two people watching you, you only have one person watching you. Also, there are the abandonment issues. They feel abandoned by the non-custodial parent. And a lot of times they are so pained, that parent is so pained that they don't want to have anything to do with their family. Or they get into another relationship and they put all their energy into that second relationship rather than the first relationship. Both of my children have abandonment issues. That may be the reason why my daughter decided to have a baby without getting married. That, and the guy was a jackass. And my son, of course, he's been engaged for, 4 or 5 years now. He's not getting married. He doesn't want to have children because, he's afraid to screw them up, I guess. Fathers benefited from joint custody because they had more frequent contact with their children. Mothers benefited because it afforded them greater opportunity for courtship. And that's always a good thing. Evidence on the effects of divorce on children. The most significant effects of divorce on children occur in the first year or two. Both the well-being of the primary parent and the level of parenting conflict are major factors influencing the outcomes. So a lot of times there's so much conflict in the family, it seems like a relief when the two are actually no longer arguing with one another. Children from families in which the parents have a great deal of conflict seem to do better following divorce than do children from low conflict families. In other words, if they're getting along fairly well and then they just kind of get divorced, that's a low conflict family. But if there's a lot of argument taking place, maybe some physical abuse taking place, either by the husband or the wife. These children seem to get to have a better situation once they get divorced than they did in the home. Conflict, of course, breeds more conflict. If they see that conflict is an acceptable alternative, a lot of times they will turn to conflict in their future dealings because they see it as a proper coping technique. Does all that make sense? Okay. It's the same way with suicide, strangely enough. Suicide does run in families. It doesn't have anything to do with genetics. It has to do with this is a proper way to deal with my situation. So if you come from a family where there have been other suicides, then the probability is that you will accept that as a viable alternative. If there isn't any suicide in your family, then probably you will be arguing with yourself quite a bit when you're trying to make that decision, because nobody else has done it. I have a brother-in-law that the reason he didn't divorce his wife is because his family didn't divorce. His mother and his father were in, it was a horrible situation. She was clinically depressed, and the father just put up with all this crap that she threw at him. And everybody asked him, why in the world didn't you divorce her? And he said, because I love her, is the reason he gave. Then when his son was in a very conflictual relationship, rather than divorce her, he said, no, my family doesn't divorce. We don't do that in my family. And eventually she had to divorce him. I know. Okay. Acceptable alternatives. If it's not an acceptable alternative, maybe it won't happen. Around 75% of children whose parents divorce will not experience significant developmental challenges or long-term negative effects of the divorce. Usually things will right themselves. It only, for the first couple of years, they will be having problems, but then, especially if they're relatively young, then they won't have any problems in the future. My problem with my ex-wife was that she kept leaving and coming back and leaving and coming back. And I was an idiot and I let her come back. I should have just kicked her ass out the first time we got a divorce. I know, I'm stupid. Well, Bryant knew that. He's going, damn, you're dumb. Yes, I am. I let her come back. And the excuse I used was that it was for the kids, but you know why I did it. Does everybody know why I did it? Do I need to explain that?
I'll answer it.
Why did I let her come back? I know. Something wrong with me. Obviously there's something wrong with me. What makes it less likely that a divorce will adversely affect the children involved? The custodial parent is competent and well-adjusted. Parent has regular and consistent contact and takes an active interest in the activities and the school performance of the child. This is particularly important, especially if it's the father. As odd as it sounds, the most important person as far as your academic career is concerned isn't your mother, it's your father. Your mother takes care of you, and your father gives you your drive to succeed. Now, maybe that's going to change in the future, but this is the way it's always been. We've been noticing this in psychology for over the last 50 years. They've done research, and what they find out is it all depends on how the father feels about education as to how you feel about education. It isn't your mother, it's your father. Now, like I said, with all the single parents out there, well, 34% of the children are being raised in single parent households. Maybe this will change in the future, or maybe it's changed now. But in the past, that's the way it's always been. So if your father was a person that wanted you to get an education, and told you he wanted you to get an education, and asked you about your homework at night, and was the individual that went to your athletic events, then you're more likely to want to be successful. As odd as that seems, we all love our mothers, but our father will impact us throughout no matter what else he does, as long as he says that, as long as he interacts with you and shows you that these things are important. I know. Strange, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. See, parenting used to be a lot different. In the old days, he was kind of removed from the family. And he wasn't supposed to show love. That was your mom's job. And his job was just to make money, I guess. And that's the way it was. He wasn't allowed to smile. I mean, it was really kind of silly. The parents are cooperative, or at least keep the child from exposure to their interparental conflicts. Because otherwise they take sides. And if they take sides, all of a sudden the child is being taken care of by a single parent. The other parent is the SOB. I made the mistake of marrying a lady that came from a family where they hated the men in the family. And it went back generations. It was terrible. And I would listen to these women just badmouth their husbands, their fathers, their grandfathers. It was horrible. And they did this out in the open. They attacked these men out in the open. And of course, as it turned out, she didn't really want to stay with anybody because she had such a negative opinion about men. Her rule was women rule, and guess what men do? Drool, yeah. What you meant that drool? Not real bright, are we? And that was the way that. Anyway, so there shouldn't be. They shouldn't see any conflict. If the child sees conflict, then they will take sides, and of course, you don't want that to happen. The custodial parent has extended family support, and that, of course, was the most important thing. When my daughter was trying to gain custody of my grandson, was the fact that she had so much support from her extended family. And were willing to go anywhere and do anything. Of course, being military, of course, we're used to just wandering around the world, so what the hell? So she's in Florida and we're in Iowa. That's just a short 3 flights away. It's only 2 days. You can stop in Chattanooga and still get to Florida the next day. That's not bad. I know. So here I am. I'm living 2 days away from my wife. I have to drive 2 days in order to get home for Thanksgiving. But we're military. It's like nothing. You know. What if you had to drive for 2 days to go someplace? How many of you would do it?
Testing them.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. But as far as we're concerned, it's a big nothing. We can handle it. There are 3 approaches to appointing evaluators. A judge can appoint one clinician to conduct a custody evaluation that is available to all parties, and this is what they normally do. Each side can retain their own expert, and this, of course, is what my grandson's father wanted to do. He wanted his own expert. He wanted to pay his own person. That's what he wanted to do. And the court said, nah, we'll bring in a mediator. The 2 sides can agree to share the expenses of hiring an expert to conduct one evaluation. Usually this is what takes place. The court appoints an evaluator. Most clinicians prefer the first or the third option. Most courts prefer number 1 or number 2. If you do number 1 or number 3, if you do number 2, normally what happens is the one with the biggest bucks is the one that wins. And that's, well, not always right. Why don't we stop right here and I'll pick it up next time right here. I'll try not to talk about my family anymore. No, I won't. Thanksgiving. Oh, don't forget. Wednesday, since I have to drive for 2 days, Wednesday of next week I will not be here. I'll be on the road, hopefully arriving in Iowa. I've got these 2 damn dogs. Oh, I didn't turn that off, did I? Whoops.